Mark, that was a good song to sing before this lesson. I really like that line about how he tears every chain apart. And that's important to what we're going to be talking about today. I would appreciate your prayers over the next couple of weeks, as 10 of us from this congregation will be leaving Tuesday morning for Israel. In fact, Lord willing, next Sunday we will be, I think, in Jerusalem. Is that right? And so we'll be taking the Lord's Supper together in Jerusalem, and we'll be remembering you here back home. But keep us in your prayers if you would. I would appreciate that. And last week has to be in my top 5 greatest worship times that I've ever experienced. It was a wonderful day. And you as a church continue to amaze me. And the problem is I can't ever preach on giving here. I mean, what would be the point? You know? But oh, what a great day it was. And I don't know what to do with one of the comments Russ made, though, because he said today's going to be kind of blah because last week we had a good speaker. So let me see if I can hook you with this. Sex is a gift. How do you like that for a sermon starter? In fact, sex is a gift from God. But the sad reality is that some of the richest, some of the most beautiful gifts from God can be twisted into things that are hideous and that are even destructive idols. Sex was God's idea, you know. He designed it in the way that He did, for it to be this intimate connection between a man and a woman who are committed to each other in marriage. And within that covenant, God created this spiritual bond, is what it is. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, it's described for us that way. When Moses writes, "This is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." It's a spiritual union that's reflected in the act of lovemaking. Interesting, one of the Hebrew words for sex is a word that is, if translated literally, means a mingling of the souls. And so, a couple of weeks ago, we discussed how food can become a god to us. That God could have simply provided for our physical sustenance with something like tree bark. And, you know, it could have taken care of that need we have to be fed. But instead, God gives us this wide range of delicious foods that we can enjoy. He gave us this gift that He just lavishes us with. He designed food to accomplish more than just to sustain our bodies. He gave us food to be a gift, to be something that we share together. He is a father who likes giving good gifts to His kids. And similarly, God could have made the reproduction process a mechanical, joyless act. He could have made sex to feel the same as our toenails growing. You do realize that, don't you? But all of God's gifts are intended to point us back to Him. The gifts should cause us to love Him and to worship the giver even more deeply. Unfortunately, it is all too easy for those very gifts that He gives us to become His greatest competitors. And when sex loses this spiritual context that we see from the very beginning, it becomes a god. It becomes an idol. It becomes a slave master. Case in point, 2 Samuel chapter 13. David was king of Israel. And in that day and time, kings, important people, nobles, would have several wives. Now, unfortunately, there are more and more people I'm hearing today who are promoting polygamy and saying, hey, the Bible teaches it. Yeah, but what does the Bible really teach about it? I mean, if you trace it through the Old Testament, you can make a better argument in the Bible that polygamy doesn't work than you can that it's something that's an option for us. It doesn't look too pretty whenever you see it in the Old Testament. And so the main characters in this story are Amnon, who is a son of David. He's a prince of Israel. And Tamar, who is David's daughter by another wife. And so they are half-siblings. And so Scripture says this, beginning in 2 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 1. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. He became so obsessed. Realize obsession is an idolatrous word. Amnon's mind was constantly fixed on this image, and it made him sick with lust. Now, he had a friend, loosely you would say, calling him a friend. He had an advisor who noticed that he wasn't looking so good, and so he asked him why, and Amnon said, well, it's because I can't get this thought out of my mind of being with Tamar. And so his friend gave him some horrible advice. He said in verse 5, go to bed and pretend to be ill. When your father comes to see you, say to him, I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight so I may watch her and then eat it from her hand. And then what happened next as this plan begins to unfold is absolutely heartbreaking. Verse 8 says, so Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the bread in his sight, and baked it. Then she took the pan and served him the bread, but he refused to eat. Send everyone out of here, Amnon said. So everyone left him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food here into my bedroom so I may eat from your hand. And Tamar took the bread she had prepared and brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom. But when she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, come to bed with me, my sister. No, my brother, she said to him, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You'd be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He'll not keep me from being married to you. But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. And after that, Tamar then followed the custom of her day to demonstrate her grief. She put ashes on her head. She tore her ornate robe. She left that room weeping and broken. Amnon's sexual sin has this snowball effect that results in incredible destruction both for his family and for his nation. And it all began with an obsession. It began with something that had become an idol to him. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, what does this story have to do with me? I would never do anything like that. I can almost guarantee you if you had asked Amnon a couple of months before this happened, he would have told you, I would never do anything like that. The God of sex specializes in taking us further than we ever intended to go. And so some of you need to wrestle with this morning. And I promise you, I'm not thinking of anyone in particular. I just know the statistics to know enough that in a room of this size, we've got a number of people who are struggling with this, who are struggling with sex being a god. So, struggle with this. Has the pursuit of sexual pleasure become an obsession for you? Do you daydream about it constantly? Do you think that you have to keep things hidden from your spouse or from your boss? Do you live in this cloud of shame about what your response to this is? You see, when something good becomes a god, its pleasure, the pleasure it brings, dies in the process. It's like a dog trying to chase its own tail. And the more a dog tries to chase its own tail, the less it's going to accomplish. Philosophers refer to this as the hedonistic paradox. And Scripture illustrates it by telling us how Amnon responded after he gives in to his lust. It didn't satisfy him. It didn't deliver what it had promised. It didn't bring him any pleasure. In fact, just the opposite occurred. Because we read in chapter 13 and verse 15, then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, "Get up and get out." Utter contempt for someone who hadn't done anything to him. Why? He was feeling shame. He was feeling guilt. The god of sex had not delivered what it had promised. And some of you know that feeling. Because the god of sexual pleasure promises us incredible satisfaction. And so, as you read magazines, or as you surf websites, or as you push those lines with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, and you obsess about what it would feel like to just give in to this desire and experience this promised ecstasy. And what happens? The God doesn't deliver. And you have this nagging feeling that you have given away a part of yourself that you can never get back. There's been research done at the University of Houston. The title of the article is Pornography's Impact on Sexual Satisfaction. And I want you to hear the things. This is not a religious study, by the way. I want you to hear the three main points they came out of this study with. Here's what it results in. Decreased satisfaction with one's sexual partner. Men and women both find their spouses less attractive, less sexually satisfying. Second is a decrease in how much one values faithfulness. Because as you read all this stuff, as you spend time putting this stuff in your head, sex outside of marriage seems less forbidding, and it becomes more of a legitimate option. Third point is a major increase in the importance of sex without attachment. Sex becomes simply a physical act rather than this Genesis 2 idea of an intimate connection. And the end result is not to be satisfied, not to be united with someone, but rather to feel isolation. Instead of satisfaction, you experience emptiness. And here's part of what this cruel God does to you, is that you almost immediately hunger for something more. There's always something more that this God promises you. Oh, you haven't experienced what you wanted because you haven't gone to the next step. And so instead of closeness and intimacy, you're left to feel lonely. Listen, I should have put this on your outline, but you have room to write this down. And I think this is important. I don't remember if I have this on PowerPoint or not. When you pursue pleasure as a god, pleasure disappears. Now, don't misunderstand what that's saying. It doesn't mean that there's not pleasure for us in life, but pleasure comes as we seek God. When we pursue pleasure itself as a god, it will not deliver. That's the hedonistic paradox. And so let's return to the story that we were in 2 weeks ago in 1 Kings chapter 18 before we had that really good speaker last week. 1 Kings chapter 18. Elijah has challenged King Ahab and told him there's going to be a severe drought. And that results in this contest being issued. And so the people of Israel gather around Mount Carmel to watch this contest. You've got Elijah on one side. You've got 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah on the other side. And Elijah says in verse 25, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, and then, since there are so many of you, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah, now you're talking about trash talking, it began a long time ago. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought or busy, literally going to the bathroom or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Now, can you imagine the sight that would have been? These false prophets are cutting themselves. They're slashing themselves in this desperate attempt to get the attention of their gods. And we shake our heads at that kind of behavior. We say, oh, that's primitive. There are many of us who have bled on the altar of the god of sex. Some of you have sacrificed your finances there. Did you know that more is spent on pornography every year in this country than on pro baseball, pro football, and pro basketball combined? Did you know that pornography grosses more than ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox combined every year? Over $10 billion. But it's not just money that's sacrificed on the sex god. There are many who have sacrificed their marriages. Some have lost their kids. Some have lost their careers. Sadly, it seems like there's hardly a month go by that I don't know of a preacher who has sacrificed his career, sacrificed his reputation at the altar of the god of sex. And many people continue to try to rationalize. Hey, it's just pictures, it's harmless entertainment. No, it isn't. It is laying our souls on the altar before a God who wants to consume us. Oh, it looks a little bit different than 1 Kings chapter 18, but make no mistake about it. Many have bled for this God, hoping to get some kind of response from this God, but the God of sexual pleasure always demands more. As Paul put it in Romans chapter 6 and verse 19, sin is ever increasing. We've seen 2 weeks ago it happens with food. We're going to see it can happen with money. And it happens with sex. The gods just keep on demanding more. And they keep teasing us with the promise that total fulfillment's just the next step. It's just right, you're close, it's just right around the corner. And so 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 29 says, midday passed and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. That's the way it is with false gods. And it's heartbreaking to see people who spend their lives worshiping a God that takes away everything and leaves them with nothing. Now, I'm guessing that the first day that Amnon noticed Tamar's beauty and lusted after her, that he was thinking, oh, it's just a thought in my head. It's not anything. After all, it's not like he was going to go, it's not like he was acting on that. It was just thinking. But understand that the battlefield of the gods is your heart. And the heart is shaped by the thoughts. And our thoughts determine who is going to win the throne of our hearts. And so Proverbs 4 and verse 23 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. In other words, be careful what you think, because what you think is going to be what you worship. Cognitive psychology examines how our thoughts shape our emotions and how they shape our behavior and our attitudes. You see, all of these are intertwined, but the important thing for us to consider is it all starts right here. It all starts with our thoughts. And so Kyle Eidelman gives this example in his book of attempting to carve a path through some thick woods with underbrush, and you work real hard and you get that path cleared, but it's still not a clear path. But then people start using that path, and over a period of time that path becomes beaten down, and it's now a trail. It's clearly seen, it's easy to walk. And the same thing happens in our brains. Scientists tell us our brains work that same way. We get a new thought that hasn't run through our brains yet, and this trail is begun, and it's called a neural pathway. And so when we're children, we first hear about this idea of sex, and we have this, it's just beginning to be cleared in our brain, but then we have TV, and we have movies, and we have music, and we have things that people say at school, and all these things that begin to beat this path in our head, a pathway through our brains. And it becomes well-traveled. And so a study was done where a man was to sit and view pornography for several hours a day. And the researchers doing this study put a baseball cap on top of the TV monitor. And so over a period of time as he did this, he came to associate that baseball cap in such a way that he could be sexually stimulated simply by someone showing him a baseball cap. And so the question is, who or what am I binding myself to? What kind of roads am I building through my mind? What kind of roads am I reinforcing in my mind? Where are these roads going to lead me? That's one of the main reasons why idolatry is so dangerous. Because our thoughts and our attitudes and our actions are determined by what we choose to worship. And if you believe that you can lock away your sexual thoughts into some kind of an airtight compartment, you have bought into a lie. Some translations of Proverbs 23 and verse 7 say this: as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. You see, our minds determine who we are, but our minds also determine who we are becoming. What are you feeding your mind? Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 5 that we are to take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. And that idea of captivity, that's what happens in our minds. We either take our minds captive for Jesus and for truth, or we allow our minds to be taken captive, to be seized by the lies of this world. Remember, we are at war. And the gods are at war for our souls. When something good becomes a god, not only does the pleasure disappear, but it often results in pain. When we worship sex as a god, it's going to lead us to the exact opposite of what the divine intent for that gift was. Because as a gift, it's intended to bring connection. But as a god, it causes loneliness. As a gift, it's intended to bring pleasure. As a god, it leads to emptiness. As a gift, it brings satisfaction. As a god, it demands slavery. As a gift, it brings intimacy. As a god, it separates. As a gift, it brings unity. As a god, it often causes divorce. It is, listen, it is a beautiful gift. But it is a brutal tyrant of a god. And when pleasure becomes our god, we experience anything but. The god of pleasure is the master of bait and switch. And so there's this funny story Idleman tells in this book. I'm not going to go into all the detail of it. I'm going to give you the nuts and bolts of it. He tells about when he got his daughter a pet goldfish. And she wanted to put the goldfish in their swimming pool, but he and his wife had to explain to her, you know, that there's chemicals in there that would probably kill the goldfish. And so she wanted it to be close, so when they went swimming, she had a glass of water, and she had the goldfish in it sitting there by the pool, and they're swimming, and Idleman said, I looked up, and the goldfish wasn't in the glass. It had flopped out and gotten into the swimming pool. He said, we could see it swimming around. Have you ever tried to catch a goldfish in a swimming pool? And so, he said, we just decided to wait and see what happened. He said, and it wasn't long, and it wasn't hard to get the goldfish because it was floating belly up. And he used that to illustrate something that I think it does a good job of it. That glass seemed to be so restrictive to that goldfish. And freedom in that big pool seemed so enticing. And at first, everything seemed all right. But it didn't take long. That restriction turned out to be a loving thing. And that freedom that the goldfish thought it was going to have turned out to be its destruction. That's how the gods of pleasure work. They offer you real freedom. They offer you real joy. But you jump in and you find out it's toxic. They tell you that God's putting these restraints on you. God's wanting to rob you of real joy in life. He is so restrictive. He wants to take away your freedoms. But the restraints are actually loving provision, loving protection. You see, what we choose to worship has powerful influence over us. And there are huge consequences involved in the choices we make, whether we are going to choose to worship the God of heaven or the God of pleasure and appetite. When God's gift of sex is turned into a god, it's only a matter of time before it stops doing what it was designed to do. But when the gift causes us to turn and worship the giver, we discover that the giver lavishes his gifts on us even more abundantly. And so we're going to have a time now where we offer an invitation if you need prayer. Again, I have no one in mind, I promise you right now. For some reason, I just feel like I need to say, maybe there's someone right now who I want to encourage you to have the guts to step out and go to room 102 and to let an elder and his wife pray with you if indeed this has become a god for you. But there may be someone who's never been washed in the blood of Jesus, never been baptized into Christ, and we would be thrilled to be able to witness that with you this morning. And so we sing a song to encourage you, to give you an opportunity. And so let's stand together and sing.